exist. There are canonical texts, and then nothing happened until Europeans arrived and colonization started. Obviously, it's pretty frustrating to hear, and speaks to some pretty large problems. It was really out of that sort of frustration that we just have this massive gap in the record. We have this absence of knowledge. You know, if any of us think that we can learn more that will benefit the present by studying ideas about the past, they shouldn't just be confined to the Christian West.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Bruno Shirley discusses his graduate research into Buddhist intellectual histories of political thought and his accompanying study of Sinhala, Tamil, and other less commonly taught languages.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we are speaking with Bruno Shirley, a graduate student in the Department of Asian Studies here at Cornell.
Bruno has studied both Sinhala and Tamil through our shared course initiative with Columbia and Yale, and his work focuses on changing ideas and practices of Buddhist sovereignty as well as accessible digital tools for students in the humanities.
We will discuss all this and more on our podcast today.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Bruno.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
So we usually like to start out our podcast by asking our guests to share a little bit about themselves and their path with languages. So let's hear it.
Yeah, so my path with languages was actually quite unusual for my field, which is at its core Buddhist studies. Buddhist studies really tends to attract people who realize early on that they have a real passion for learning languages. They can't get enough of it, and they're just trying to look for, among other reasons for getting into Buddhist studies, they really want to have some kind of academic field or profession where they get to make the most of that skill. So it's very common for people, particularly working on early Buddhism, to sort of already have Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, classical Chinese, Japanese, before they're even looking at grad school.
Yeah.
I did not take that route. I never really took language learning seriously for most of my life. And I actually started out in political science. It was sort of once I ended up coming to grad school for Buddhist studies and really trying to take seriously Buddhist political ideas, and I was like, okay, I've got to do some catch up here and really start to make the most of what Cornell has to offer in terms of particularly the less commonly taught languages like Sinhala and Tamil.
Well, so your focus of study involves historical Buddhism and intersections of kingship, religion, and gender performance. You've described it as Buddhist intellectual histories of political thought. Can you walk us through what led you to these topics and tell us more about your work?
Absolutely. So, as I said, I started out in political science, and I was really interested in political theory. We did sort of the history of political theory, and we looked at, St. Augustine and St. Thomas of Aquinas and Hobbes. And these are all very, very Christian people, many saints. And because I'd always had this sort of interest in Buddhism, I pretty reasonably asked, okay, well, that's Christian political theory, what does the history of Buddhist political theory look like? And the answer was usually, well, either we don't know, or sometimes it didn't really exist. There are canonical texts, and then nothing happened until Europeans arrived and colonization started. Which obviously is pretty frustrating to hear, and speaks to some pretty large problems. There are, of course, now more scholars working on this, particularly in East Asia. My advisor here at Cornell, Anne Blackburn, is doing some really wonderful work. But it was really out of that sort of frustration that we just have this massive gap in the record. We have this absence of knowledge. And, if any of us think that we can learn more that will benefit the present by studying ideas about the past, they shouldn't just be confined to the Christian West.
Of course,
And so now here I am doing very, very niche studies of 12th century Sri Lanka.
Wow, that's crazy. So you already talked a little bit about how learning less commonly taught languages has kind of infiltrated your area of study and interest. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience learning these less commonly taught languages here in Cornell and exactly what the connection there is between your work and your own teaching?
Absolutely. So the less commonly taught languages that I'm working with here, as I said, are Sinhala, which is the majority language from Sri Lanka, and then Tamil, which is spoken is a majority language in some parts of South India, Tamil Nadu particularly, but then also it's a significant minority language in Sri Lanka and in other places around South and Southeast Asia as well. And I should say as well, in their diasporas, including
Sure.
diasporas of Asian Americans, including people here at Cornell. So a lot of the people who are taking these courses very reasonably want to speak these languages. They are very much living languages. We have heritage speakers here at Cornell. We have students who maybe have friends who spoke these languages and just think, yeah, that sounds really cool. I wish I too could speak Sinhala. And as a result, a lot of the curriculum here is really geared towards building up your spoken competency, building up your reading abilities with contemporary literature. So can you read a newspaper? Can you sort of operate in day-to-day life? And that's all, very important, particularly as someone who likes to spend time in that part of the world. But obviously my research is focused on the 12th century.
Yes.
So it's very interesting. It has been very interesting for me to be in these classes where we are focusing on like building up conversational competency.
Yeah.
And then me sort of going, wow, I really want to be, reading this very, very archaic form of the language and these old written texts. And then it's also been actually, a little frustrating, particularly, with the pandemic, not being able to travel. And then having spent all these years working on these old texts, and then I sort of go back and I want to talk to my friends in Sinhala, and I realize I've forgotten how to talk like a normal 21st century person. So it's a pretty strange experience, sort of doing really historically oriented work as a graduate student and trying to make the most of these programs as they're designed, but also get what I need from my research out of it.
Yeah.
And then also not sound like a small child when I speak these languages who can't remember basic vocabulary, but knows words about, government, statecraft, gender very, very well.
Yeah.
It's a strange experience.
Yeah.
Well, in addition to your interest in Buddhism and everything surrounding that, you also have an interest in making digital tools feel more accessible to scholars in the humanities. And you've mentioned particularly tools for digital map making. What inspired your interest in this area, and what have you learned from pursuing it?
So in terms of the inspiration, again, a lot of this comes down to, lockdown. I couldn't go my field work, had a lot of spare time on my hands. I wanted to develop some skills. I think it's increasingly important for scholars, particularly like, quote unquote junior scholars, to have at least some degree of digital competency. Because I think that, these digital tools can seem very inaccessible at first, but can be so helpful in our research if we sort of know enough of our way around them that we can at least try to apply them. That's obviously really difficult when we're working with, again, very archaic or classical languages from parts of the world that don't tend to be attended to. And it's not exactly, say, Google's priority in developing good language models for 12th century Pali. So, I mean, map making, obviously, I can do these nice maps, and it's actually really easy to do nice maps. I do a lot of, I try to do a lot of sort of like tutorials and outreach for scholars who really wish they could make nice maps and don't know how easy it is. But I will admit it's a little harder to try and think about, putting, say, database or integrating databases into those maps, trying to work with historical data and having to make calls on, how we accommodate this really intensely multilingual environment. Sri Lanka in the 12th century, there were at least 4 languages that were used. Well, there were 3 that were used highly interchangeably. So Sinhala, Pali, and Sanskrit. People would switch between them in a single text. You might have, common, a single name or place name will have variant names in each of these that can be referred to in any language. And then Tamil is also very much in the mix. Everyone's reading Tamil, even if they're not necessarily all writing in it. So it's trying to put that into a nice, clear, uncluttered map or database, or even just sort of a nice computer-readable, machine-readable data format.
Yeah.
You have to make a lot of difficult and subjective choices about which languages you're prioritizing at certain times or the other, which languages you're conflating or which terms you're conflating versus when you might want to leave them distinct. It's a fun challenge. And I'm saying that both very, very genuinely and a little bit sarcastically. It's very fun. It's
great. So you've given us glimpses into the work that you're doing, but can you synthesize in like your elevator pitch here what your thesis is actually about?
Absolutely. So, as I say, my sort of body of work is really born out of this frustration that we just don't know what political theory looked like in basically the entire period between the closing of the Pali canon, or the collection of scriptures written in this language Pali. Maybe sometimes we consider the 5th century commentaries of Buddhaghosa upon that canon, and then sort of nothing until white people come along and start radically changing that part of the world. So I'm trying to flesh that out a little more, and in particular, I'm trying to argue that there was actually original and innovative political thought happening in that space in between. It was happening sometimes in the Pali language, but sometimes also in what we call vernacular or local languages like Sinhala and Tamil, and sometimes in Sanskrit as well, which, because of complex historical reasons, often when we think about Buddhism and Sanskrit, we assign it to a particular sect or tradition of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, which we maintain, or most of the scholarly literature says, is not present in Sri Lanka that late. So when texts are in Sanskrit, we tend to ignore them and go, oh, that doesn't fit our narrative. If it's Buddhist, it has to be in Pali. And the dissertation in particular, I'm looking at a series of monarchs and monks from the 12th century who I argue are putting forward some conflicting visions of what it meant to be a good Buddhist king. And in particular, how that idea of sort of good Buddhist kingship intersected with morality, and how it intersected with masculinity as well. So the idea was if you're a good Buddhist king, that means that fundamentally you're a good man. And that posed some interesting challenges for the period's female monarchs, who had to come up with some creative performances of kingship, of how they presented themselves as good Buddhist kings, which sort of practices of masculinity they might selectively engage with and which they might try to avoid. But ultimately, it's just really trying to take their outputs in literary works and scholastic works, but even things like inscriptions or art and architecture, seriously as political philosophy, and think, okay, what does this tell us about relationships, or the potential possible relationships between power, morality, and gender, or masculinity in particular?
That's interesting. So do you have reading proficiency then in Pali and Sanskrit as well?
Yes. I had Pali before I came to Cornell because it's, again, this good Buddhist language you should have. I started doing Sanskrit, which is entirely taught as a classical language. It's entirely a reading language. After I arrived here, I'd put off learning Sanskrit for quite a long time on the grounds that Buddhism in Sri Lanka doesn't use Sanskrit. And then I realized, that's actually not true. And then through the LRC, I've been doing Sinhala, which is taught here by Professor Bandara Herat. And I've only relatively recently started Tamil.
Okay. So it sounds like you would make a good Buddhist king then.
Well, there is the morality side of it, I suppose.
Good answer.
We'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that.
I did just want to say, because we mentioned to our last guests that you were going to be on the show, and someone said, "Oh, you should ask him about the 3-minute thesis presentation."
Okay, so the 3-minute thesis competition is run every year by Cornell's graduate school. It's based off a competition that started in Australia, actually, which is very near to, but not my country. I'm from New Zealand, just because the accent can be misleading. And basically, the idea is that, well, the idea behind it is that graduate students are often not very good at these elevator pitches. You asked me to give an elevator pitch, and it probably went on for a bit longer than the normal elevator ride.
Depends on what elevator you're in.
Yeah, I mean, a very tall building.
Yes.
And basically, the idea of the 3-minute thesis competition is that you have 3 minutes and one static slide, no animations, no slide transitions, to distill what's interesting about your dissertation to a very, very mixed and general audience. So it's run every year here at Cornell. I think it's all PhD students after their A exams, and maybe also master's students, are eligible to enter it. So I did it last year. It was very, very fun. And then I also did sort of a regional variant of it among like northeastern schools, which was also very fun. And yeah, I've got no real, this sentence isn't really going anywhere now.
No, but that's but you.
It was
thank
fun
you.
and you should do it.
There we go. I like it. I like it. Well, and I'm sure you've heard of this too. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, they do an annual contest that is the annual Dance Your PhD contest, where these scientists put a dance performance, so they articulate their dissertation in that format, which is quite amazing to watch.
I definitely don't have the rhythm for that. I'm going to stick with the 3 minutes of talking. I'll leave the dancing to my partner.
Okay, there we go.
Her dissertation will be brilliant as interpretive dance, I'm sure.
There we go.
I love that. You've talked a lot about your work and the different languages you've learned along the way. What advice do you have for students who are interested in studying less commonly taught languages? What might be different about that journey than studying, say, French or Spanish?
So my advice for students thinking about studying less commonly taught languages is to do it. They have that name for a reason. We have languages that you can basically only learn here at Cornell. Sinhala is a great example.
Yep.
Outside of Sri Lanka, there was a university in the UK you could study it at. There may still be a university in China, I think Tsinghua, that has at least some level of Sinhala. But Cornell is really the only place that has a Sinhala professor teaching at all three levels of the language. So this is, it's a really unique opportunity. And because these classes are usually taken by a much smaller number of students than something like Intro to French or Intro Japanese, you also get a lot more face time with the teacher. Hopefully, me promoting this will slightly change that. This is somewhat counterintuitive. But, I've been in Sinhala classes where there's sort of 3 or 4 of us and the professor in the room. And that makes for a very different language environment to say if you're going to a lecture with, 100, 200 people in it, and then you've got your little discussion sections, you can make progress a lot faster. And the Sinhala curriculum is a great example of that. By the end of the first year, you're pretty much done with, you have at least a basic grasp of all of the elements of spoken grammar. You can have pretty decent conversations. You can get around and operate pretty well. The second year is just about building your fluency, expanding your vocabulary, and then the third year, you're tackling literary Sinhala.
Yeah.
Sinhala is a diglossic language. The literary grammar is different, so it does need a whole separate year to work through that. But you can make very surprisingly fast progress in these small focused classes.
Great.
So there is no downside. Take these languages. They're great.
I like it. There you have it, people. Take all the languages, especially the less commonly taught ones. Well, and all the languages. We don't. we support all the languages.
All the languages, but especially those run by the Department for Asian Studies. Please and thank you.
I like it. So, Bruno, where can our listeners learn more about you and your work?
That is a great question. Stay tuned for my forthcoming dissertation.
There we go. What's the timeline on that? Dare I ask? That's a question you never should ask a PhD student.
That is a very hurtful question, yes.
Yes.
So I'm currently in my 5th year. I'm probably going to aim to defend toward the end of my 6th year.
Okay.
I was really optimistic I was going to smash this thing out in 5 years. So you don't need that much time to write a dissertation. And it turns out actually with, a pandemic and interrupted fieldwork and everything, you do need quite a bit of time to write a dissertation.
Sure.
So hopefully at some point in the next academic year,
There we go.
it'll be done.
Great.
Well, we so appreciate you coming in and chatting with us. But before we sign off, we'd like to ask you to share a word in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, that makes you laugh. What is that word?
So I have to confess, I was given warning this question would come up, and I spent the entire last week trying to think of a good enough answer. And the best I could come up with is, and I think this really illustrates some of the difficulty of both, working with these sort of still very living languages, but then, doing your research on these very archaic things. There's a word in Sanskrit, amba, which is a very respectful way of addressing a woman. Usually a mother, because, maternal imagery is very important, patriarchy, whole side point. And there is a word in contemporary Sinhala, amba, which means mango. And the number of times that I have sat around in a reading group with my friends, all good proper Sanskritists with some complicated philosophical text around, and I'll go, look, I'm really struggling with this section. Why is the Buddha so interested in mangoes? What is the point of this sermon here?
Nice.
It hasn't happened a lot, but it has happened at least once, and I found that quite funny.
That's great. That's great. Oh my. Well, thanks so much for speaking of language with us today, Bruno.
You're very welcome. Thanks so much for having me here. It was a blast.
Next week, we'll speak with Isabel Kohanovsky and Dennis Wagner, PhD candidates in German studies at Cornell, about language teaching, cosmic contacts, and puppets. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
or follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.